please don't apologize at all. We've had technical difficulties too, so it's okay.
Yeah, we've had countless of technical difficulties. Sometimes it even takes 20 minutes to get something on, so you really don't have to worry about anything.
Yeah, we're nice and chill here too, so don't feel like you have to be professional around us. You can say whatever you want here, so feel free. We're just a bunch of nerds who want to know about what you love to talk about and what you're about. Me and I was originally supposed to do the show, but I had to toss it off to Dandan. Then I had the opportunity to come back on here, so we're both going to be with you.
Yes,
and we know your areas of expertise, but I usually start my shows, and this is Dandan's show, but I usually start my shows by asking the guest, what are they working on right now? What are you most in love with, interest wise at the moment? What is your, you get what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got an answer that would have surprised me an awful lot only 2 or 3 years ago, is that I'm working on telepathy.
Telepathy.
When I was quite young, when I was writing my first book, in fact, around in the late 1990s, I was writing about communication, and there's a kind of philosophical commonplace about communication which I was critically reading. Like, I wasn't happy with it, and that idea was that, I mean, let's put it really crudely, in me there's a mind, in you there's a mind, and when we communicate, we're putting outside noises that you hear and your mind will interpret with a meaning, and I'll have sent out, as it were, with a meaning.
Yeah.
And so if one puts it starkly, it's the idea that there's a kind of cabinet of consciousness, and communication is some relationship between two cabinets. And that means that communication on that model is always a bit indirect, because you never really know what somebody's means or what they're thinking, and particularly you don't know what they're feeling, because those sorts of things are completely private. And so I was looking at this kind of conception of communication and wondering what would be, how would things look if, instead of thinking that there was this interiority of one person on one side and the interiority of another person on the other, and somehow making a connection between them, what if when we speak to each other, what you hear is something you understand, so that, as it were, there's not this shift from meaningless noise to an interpreted meaning.
Right. Like a semiology kind of thing.
Yeah. So if I say the word cube to you, maybe you just understand what that means.
Right.
And without having to sort of translate it into some kind of inner meaning or something like that.
Yeah, we know the sign, right? We know the semiology. We know that Q stands for that linguistically.
Yeah. So if the old model made it look like that all communication between people is in some ways indirect, then this other way of thinking might suggest that it's not indirect, that we can directly understand what somebody's saying and what they mean. And on the old model, that's telepathy. And so even back then, I had this little idea that, in a way, all communication is a direct meeting of minds. And if all communication is a direct meeting of minds, then telepathy is in a certain way the normal thing. Not some kind of paranormal thing. And now, that was back then. and I didn't write anything about that in the book that I wrote in the 1990s. I was young and probably too scared. During lockdown here in 2020, I thought I'm going to write a little essay on telepathy, just to, as it were, pass the time when I couldn't do anything else.
Right.
And I started doing that, and it just got wildly out of control and is turning rapidly into a book, which is also a book about magic. So telepathy was interpreted in the 19th century and into the 20th century as an illusion, and thought to be a sort of deluded kind of thinking that belongs to magic. It would be a kind of magical communication. And so I started getting interested in magic, and then I'm going to have to finish this bit because it's going on too long. But then
You're fine. You're fine.
I saw a connection between what I was doing and something that had been occupying me probably for the last 10 years, which was a really problematic way in which Europeans have interpreted world history. And that interpretation sees world history as moving through three basic stages, from magic to religion to science. So that's a kind of sequence. As it were.
Is this the same way that Auguste Comte talks about it, from like theological, metaphysical, positive stuff?
Yes, exactly, yeah. And so that's a really standard interpretation of human cognitive evolution, as it were, and development and progress. And moving away from myth, magic, superstition is the way in which we've understood our modernity. What if that conception of our own history is a kind of myth, and that magic never went away, and that magic isn't what we thought it was? All sorts of things. So
in a way, are you redefining magic and stripping away its like supernatural / mystical components and grounding it in a understanding rather than in a like reductionist like understanding of reality itself?
That's such a good question. I think I'd have to say that there's something right there, that we have tended to think of magic as a supernatural act if it happens, and therefore in a way it doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. How might it be? How might one begin to think about what human beings are, what kind of practice human beings are engaged in when they do what we now call magic?
Okay.
And one of the first step I make is to suggest that, first of all, we shouldn't really distinguish it from religion. And so,
you think magic and religion are inextricably linked?
I think so, yes. I think that magical beliefs, what we call magical beliefs and practices, the sorts of ceremonial activities.
Yeah, like mythic traditions and like wisdom traditions, all the old stuff before religions, right?
Right, exactly. And I don't think that the, as it were, if we want to see a transition from magic to religion, is a fundamental changeover in the kind of practices that human beings are involved in. Now, one of the things that I want to say there is that what does happen are efforts to exorcise, in those transitions, exorcise spiritual contamination, spiritual corruption. So the person that we now would say is a religious believer would want to say that the person who had magical beliefs had a a corrupt understanding of what it is to live a
Oh, a
spiritual
flawed
life.
epistemology. I got you.
Yeah, and so the religious believers started to call magic superstition, and then later, of course, the scientists came to say that what the religious believer believed was superstition, and I think that what we're just seeing there is a sequence of efforts to produce a conception of our spiritual existence which is free from distorting illusions of the spiritual life. And I think in a way that carries on into a scientific conception too. It's an effort to free ourselves from illusions and delusions. And the movements through which we get rid of these, we attempt to get rid of these are all, I think, sort of exorcisms, because they want them to completely disappear. They want these illusions gone. They want them to be done with and no longer contaminating our life. And exorcism is, of course, like a basic spiritual understanding of ridding ourselves of something that we're contaminated by. And so even the scientific world hasn't, as it were, set that exorcising ambition aside. And perhaps the best illustration of that, which is something I've written about previously, is something that Nietzsche called the murder of God.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the death of God is not like thought of as anything except for a complete effective disappearance of God from the world, and hence the proponents of that kind of view are themselves caught up in practices which they would, as it were, disavow, because
that's right.
They're caught up in that same development. Anyway, that's quite a long way from telepathy now.
but I actually want to tie it back to telepathy, because you talked about communication. We talked about magic, and this magic as like an experience. Tom and I went over like your history, and you wrote about Sartre. He's someone that the gaze, right, in the way he speaks about it. That is something that I guess we experience in a really magical way, and it's not like we're using any words, right, with the way it affects us socially and in society. Can you expand on that? Is that related at all to your idea of telepathy at all?
I feel the gaze. I do really. I've felt that. I'm sorry. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah. No, you do. If somebody's looking at your back, you can definitely feel that. I think one of the interesting things that Sartre wants to bring in with the gaze is that once again, there's this not.
So are you guys saying the gaze as in homosexuals?
Guys, we can't. Guys, for a moment, I'm sorry, Professor. Let's not. Anybody in the audience, let's please stay muted until Professor Simon has had his full time. I'm so sorry, Professor. Go ahead.
Okay, I can't see anything now. There you go.
That's okay. There's a lot of other people in here with us right now. I apologize for that.
Okay. Being seen by the other shouldn't be understood, Sartre wants to say, as you see a body which behaves in a certain way and then you interpret it as significant or meaningful, but you directly see the being there of another person. And so that is, again, this sort of unmediated, direct relation to the subjectivity of another person. And that would be...
what did they call that? It's called the other. What is that called, Professor? Is that called the other and the look? Is that what we're getting into here?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so everyone in the chat is a little bit confused. We're not saying the gaze as in people who are homosexuals.
Gaze.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
The gaze, like the way you look at someone. Yeah, people are very confused about that.
Okay. Right.
No, that's good. That's good.
The look. Let's call it the look.
The look. Let's look at the look.
Yeah,
Okay.
there you go. Yeah, the other and the look. Do you want to?
Yeah.
I was going to say, would you expound on that for us?
Well, I think I just did really, but I
Yeah.
think.
Oh,
that,
no. I'm sorry. I didn't hear then. I apologize.
Yeah. No, I'm just sort of saying that it's another example of these sort of cases where what's given to you experientially doesn't really fall short of seeing what's the case for another person. So, for example, I can see if in ordinary circumstances, I can see that somebody's in pain, for example, or I could see that they're unhappy or happy or annoyed or not listening anymore. All those things which are fine shades of human behaviour and that are bound up with, as it were, a mental life. These are something that one can see. Now, the look is also the situation where you shift from you yourself looking at something. So if at the moment I'm looking at this screen and can see the little icons and stuff like that, but I might suddenly be aware that somebody over here is looking at me. And then I switch from being, as it were, a subject who's open to the world to being an object in that world themselves under the look of another.
Yeah.
And so you get a sense of yourself as being both open to a world, but also in the very world in which you are open.
Yeah.
You are open to. So
I think what I'm picking up right now is that I'm kind of remembering myself as a child, playing with my toys in my room, and then noticing that either my parent or my sibling is looking at me, playing with those toys in my own world, and it knocks you straight out of it. You're no longer in it. You become something else. That's
right. So you have the kind of absorbed dimension, which was you're playing on your own, as it were, and just inhabiting the world of your own feelings. And when the other person sees you, you're thrown out of that absorbed activity where you can be, and suddenly Sartre's example is hysterical. It's also not very nice. It's about a man who's looking through a keyhole at somebody in another room, right? They're a voyeur of some sort, and so they suddenly though hear the sound of footsteps on the stairs, and they're thrown at that moment from being somebody who's completely absorbed in what they're seeing through the keyhole to themselves being
looked
seen.
at.
Being looked at. Yeah.
So, like in the basic phenomenological sense, it's like oneself intersubjectively creating the objectivity of existence in a way. Is that?
Well, let's simplify it. We could just say that all relations between us can be thought of as mind reading. We're mind readers.
Oh, okay.
Right? So that instead of being sort of closed off from other people and closed off from the world, what's given is the other's, how it is for the other person. And one can think of it as reading the behavior, reading the other person, and through that becoming a mind reader. And of course, that's back to the sort of telepathy idea.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I do think that it makes. I do think that our own intelligibility as human beings is illuminated by that image of thinking of us as mind readers rather than as people who inhabit these interior cabinets of consciousness and never have any access to how things are, things really are for other people. So we're the mind readers.
So you would say we're all telepathic. We're all mind readers. We all have a dorm room waiting for us at the X-Men mansion.
That's right. But unfortunately, this way of putting it, it takes the fun out of it a little bit. I mean, in a way, it makes ordinary life more interesting because you can think that your relations with other people are not closed off, and that when you there's a really lovely example that I read in a novel of two people who were in a room talking to each other, and also in the room was the cleaner, somebody doing the I can't remember what. Like she might have been hoovering, or not hoovering because that's too noisy, but she was cleaning.
Okay.
And one of the people knew her, but hadn't ever really attended to her. And at some point in the novel, that person turns her attention to the cleaner and sees the person as if for the first time. And it's not as if something new was given. It's just that this attention had not been given to this person before. And what I like to call the singularity of a person becomes accessible to you, right? And this is a really mind reading is sort of interesting in the sense of, okay, you can really see how things are for another person. But if you think about that a bit more deeply, you can think that one of the things that can be revealed to us is the singularity of this person. That is, this person being a unique existence, each one of us being the one of a kind, rather than each one of us just being an instance of some generic type. Each one of us being the only one, and indeed that's what's the sort of the crucial feature of being the kind of beings that we are, that we live these lives which begin at birth and end in death, and ours is our own life to live. And this is not something unavailable to you either in another person. You can relate to them as this unique existence.
Mm-hmm.
This is much the easiest way of doing this is when you're in love with them, because they're, as it were, their singularity is completely, in a way, transparent to you.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. I like that. I like that a lot.
I'm thinking a lot about my own discussions and my own conversations with people, and there seems to me to be a lot of I totally hear what you're saying, and I resonate with it, and I understand it from an experiential perspective, and but a lot of times I speak with people who are much more analytically minded, and someone who sort of study who studies continental philosophy, and this is your world. How does a person, or how have you seen their students or yourself? How do people move and be able to start thinking in this more continental way than a strict analytic fashion? In a way,
I have a quick question. How can we learn to think between them and use them both in a synthetic way?
Okay, that's a good question too.
Yeah, that's what I was asking. Better way of putting it.
Right. Let's start with where you begin with students. And now, in the work I do at the European Institute, I'm asking questions about what it means to be a European. And not all my students are European, incidentally. They'll be from all over. They're literally from all over the world.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I'll be working with them is what's it mean to be European? And this is a question that isn't unfamiliar to anyone. And what I have to try to do is to take a question which is already familiar to you in some way and try to engage with it in a way that I regard as philosophical, as opposed to, for example, sociological or historical or political or scientific. And so how might one approach the question of trying to understand how philosophy can make a contribution to understanding Europe and what it is to be a European. And it's at that point that I make a step that I think would be a step I would recommend in any area, with any philosophical question, which is to start looking at what philosophers have already said. So rather than thinking we can do this, as it were, just by discussing amongst ourselves.
Yeah, I agree.
Right? I take a route which is, I suppose, very traditional. I'd say, let's look at what Kant said, or let's look at what Marx said, or Husserl said, or some figure from our history who has themselves undertaken an inquiry of such a kind. And then, Thomas, just to say, working between them for a long time now, I mean, it really from when I was a student, I didn't give a damn about the distinction between the more analytic and the more continental type of things.
Right.
I was really interested in what people say, and I found, as it were, beautiful things from all sorts of places, and I never found it compelling or necessary to think, oh, that's an analytic philosopher, so I don't read that, or that's a continental figure, so I don't read that.
That's the best way to look at it. I marry the two, and I don't separate them. Back in the day when there was a separation, and the two, the British empiricist versus the German idealist and all that. That's not how philosophy is done today. So, and you're very well aware of that. So, I'm preaching to the choir.
Right. I mean, it's not to say that those institutional divisions don't exist anymore, because they certainly do, and there are lots of different ways of going on with the subject that calls itself philosophy. And it can be that some people find particular ways of going on particularly compelling. They find it answers to what they want from philosophy. And so I have friends who are my analytic friends, as it were, who they have no interest in reading the sorts of things I've come to find important. And I don't regard them as morally corrupt or anything like that as a result, and I don't regard myself as some kind of hero either. I do think my own formation was a little bit unusual at the time when I was at university in England. All the departments were analytic. I mean, apart from like two, and nearly all the teachers in all the departments were analytic. So it wasn't just like it was dominant; it was absolutely dominant.
Oh yeah.
And I sort of had a slightly unusual formation in that regard, in that I wasn't really very good at it, and so I was a bit lost when I was a first year as a student, and I was reading these texts, and I felt like I was dyslexic, or like somebody for whom the words were just sort of
they were going in, but they weren't.
Nothing was there for me. Yeah, nothing was making sense for me, and I didn't enjoy that at all, and I did wonder what I was doing. But I found a book. And it's quite an old story of mine, but I think it's worth repeating. I found a book in my dad's house, which my eldest brother had left there, and he'd had enough of it. I was at the beginning of my second year as an undergraduate, and I started reading this book just because basically I had nothing else to do. It wasn't some kind of, anticipating the future or anything. And it was written completely differently, and it just seemed really weird. And one of the things that I'd always hoped from philosophy is that it would be a bit weird. I think that's what I thought when I was young.
Okay.
Because the word is so wild. I mean, I thought it was a kind of mystery word, philosophy. It sounds extraordinary, and yet everything I'd was reading, it didn't seem odd, or it didn't seem to take me anywhere. Anyway, I started reading this book, and one of the things that was great about this book is that it was written in short paragraphs, which were separated from each other, and so you could read a little bit. You didn't have to read pages and pages and pages. Okay. You could just read a little bit. And I got really hooked on that book.
What's in with the book?
That completely changed my life. The book that changed my life was Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations.
Oh, my God. Okay, yes, I've read a decent amount of that. Yeah.
My eldest brother just had got rid of it. He'd thrown it in a box in my dad's house.
Oh, wow.
And I just came across it. And because I was doing philosophy at university, I thought, I should have a look at this.
Yeah, I read the Tractatus and a bit of.
Oh, yeah, that's also a wild book.
Yeah.
He's definitely not an.
Wittgenstein's a hero of mine. I love Wittgenstein.
Okay. Well, he was very much my hero when I was young. And actually, he'd be a good example of somebody who can't really be corralled happily into a kind of analytic or a continental way.
That's right. You're dead right. Yep.
And so I think that having that formation of getting excited by philosophy first by reading Wittgenstein meant that I was already sort of predisposed to, one, reading fairly difficult texts and finding enormous rewards for doing that. I remember the first time I read Kant, and I was actually in my 20s then. A lot of people read Kant when they're an undergraduate, but I didn't. And so I read him as a graduate student, having done a lot of philosophy by then, and I felt like I was going home. But I also thought it blew me away at quite how extraordinary it was. And I sort of spent, I think one day I spent about 7 hours just reading, which is probably not healthy.
No, but
I think some people today, some parents would be really happy if their kids sit down and read a book for 7 hours.
Yeah.
So rather than scrolling through TikTok or whatever it is they're doing.
Oh God, yeah. There's when I was 21, on my birthday, somebody had bought me a book, and then in the evening, everybody said, "Should we go to a club now?" And I said, I think I'd just like to read my book.
No, I'm just going to read my book.
I'm just going to read my book.
I want to explore it a little bit more.
I think I'd become, actually, I'd sort of become a philosopher then, and I absolutely hadn't seen that coming.
You didn't see that coming?
No.
But philosophical investigations really took you there, huh? That was the one that did it.
Are you happy you're a philosopher? Are you glad that this is like, or are there some days like, oh man, I can't believe I have to write another thing, or I have to go into another class?
I can't believe my luck. I mean, generally speaking, if you're an academic, you work in a university and have some job security, so tenure or some permanent contract, it's quite hard for them to get rid of you. And so that's that is something that a lot of people could feel envious about. But the real envy, if you want to be envious of me, the real envy should be that every day I'm doing something I really love.
That's amazing.
That's awesome.
Amazing. And as a teacher, I have this amazing privilege to be able to explore questions philosophically that maybe they haven't engaged with before. I mean, in fact, I know they haven't. And, I mentioned that I work at a European institute now, not in a philosophy department, and I teach courses based around Europe and European cultural identity. I absolutely try to do this as a philosopher. And read philosophical texts with them, discover how far Europe's cultural identity is entangled with philosophy. And really central, not only Europe being, as it were, the culture which has cultivated philosophy, like, it's supported its activity in one way or another in culturally. But perhaps even more deeply, European culture is what it is only in virtue of its having this relationship to philosophy and science, but philosophy first. And one of the things that philosophy gave, well, no, philosophy didn't give this to Europe. It's Europe producing is an idea of what it is to be a human being. And that idea in that European tradition is, roughly speaking, the idea of a being which is rational, a rational animal. The Greeks called us please, everyone listening, my sincere apologies for my Greek here, but it's zoon, logon, ekon. And the zoon, logon, ekon is the living thing, the zoe, the animal, the living thing with the capacity for the logos. And logos is almost untranslatable, but it means, for example, word, but it also means meaning. It means intelligibility. And then it got translated in the Latin of the First Roman Republic. That Greek idea got translated as animal rationale, the animal with ratio, with reason. And we understand ourselves still today as the rational animal. And that kind of endowment for European humanity to have this particular understanding of what it is to be a human being is absolutely fundamental to European history. Because that animal, when you understand yourself as that animal, a particular view of human history looks unavoidable, which is that human history is the unfolding development of rational animality in time from a very primitive condition in which most of our rational capacities are dormant, a movement of history in which they become increasingly actual and realized. And it opens up the idea of an end of human history in which we have attained a kind of rational status in a sort of exemplary way. All the philosophers, sorry, just finish this point.
Yeah, go ahead.
Dandan. All the philosophers in Europe, the European philosophers, interpreted human world history as moving towards this end, where we would realize ourselves in a way which was free, happy, and rational. And this kind of conception of the movement of world history is absolutely fundamental to Europeans, but unfortunately it's bound up with European disasters too, because Europeans interpreted themselves at the head of this history, and they would call other cultural groups backward in comparison or primitive in comparison. We know what happened as a result. Correct. And so this thing which was sort of an extraordinary cultural development in the emerging European world also gave rise to the worst. And studying this with students is just an extraordinary thing, to be able to shed light on the Enlightenment, but also on colonization and European imperialism and so on.
The spread of Western philosophy and ideals, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but that being a sort of double-edged sword, or it has something that remains unavoidable and one must inherit in a certain way, but also something that must be inherited profoundly critically today, that it can't be accepted that European culture is at the head of human development. This goes back to what I was saying right at the beginning about seeing history as this movement from magic
Yes.
to religion to science, which is basically the schema that Europeans have given themselves of their own development, and everybody else who is playing catch up, as it were.
But they themselves might be caught up in their own religious or magical thinking.
Well, that is exactly what. So we've rather come backwards to it, Dandan. But the work that I'm doing now is part of that work of attempted critique of, as it were, conventional Eurocentric thinking about European and world history, and seeing that the supposed age of critique and disenchantment is it's not free of the kinds of magical thinking, and even in some ways religious spiritual thinking that it supposes itself to be.
When you say that's religious, we've talked about rituals, and I'm thinking back, I'm just thinking right now to the state Europe finds itself, where a lot of the European identity, at least politically, I see in many ways breaking apart, where like you have the rise of the Golden Dawn Party and different groups and all over Europe. French right-wing nationalism is on the rise, and where they're distinct, and they're making them distinct from Brexit was a whole thing. I know you wrote about Brexit.
Yeah.
What do you think is happening to European identity, or what do you think is this a backlash to, like you said, this imperialistic colonialistic European identity, and this like a backlash to it, or is this a reasserting specific nations as distinct from European whole? Like, what is happening?
That's such a good question. Do you know what Dandan, the question that I ask my students is, what is happening?
Yeah.
Like what is happening with European identity? What is exactly happening?
What is happening? And one of the things that I will do with my students is to look at some of the things that people have said, and one of the recurrent images that have been given for this question of what is happening is that we are in a space or a time in our own history in which there's the dying of an old world and a new world not yet there, so that we're in a sort of time between times, or in a worldless space between worlds. As Matthew Arnold in 1885, who was an English writer, he says, we're wandering between two worlds, one dead, the other powerless to be born. And I think that the old world, the one that's dying, is one where we Europeans had a confident sense of themselves as belonging to a history of humanity on the way to its perfection. A history of progress and rational progress. And that was a conception of world history that, as it were, was the absolute default for Europeans. But it isn't anymore. And so me and my students, when we're asking what is happening, we're asking it from a point of world history in which those old answers are no longer compelling. There's a French philosopher who said something quite famous about this, but he's almost never situated correctly, in my view, when people say it. It's a philosopher called Jean-François Lyotard, and he said that we were modern. We can think of ourselves as modern when we were committed to a certain kind of meta-narrative of world history, a philosophy of history, he called it. And that's a philosophy of history which we understand as a movement of humanity unfolding towards a sort of ideal perfection.
Logos, right?
Everything becoming rationally intelligible, including ourselves. And if you have this conception of a movement of world history and yourself as Europeans at the head of it, and as it were, the world and history make sense. But Lyotard goes on to say that in our time, we've reached a point of what he calls incredulity towards these meta-narratives of world history. We don't believe them. They're incredible to us. We've become incredible. And it's a very odd time to be, because all the ways in which we've made sense of our lives are sort of exhausted, and they just don't make sense to us anymore. So unless we're very old-fashioned Marxists, perhaps, we're less. We can't make sense of the idea that there's a kind of rational intelligibility to all of history, that it's going in a single direction, that it aims at human perfection.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't understand this idea of history as a civilizational process anymore.
No, I know a lot. Sorry.
Yeah.
I know a lot of thinkers blame that for the current global privations that we see. And a lot of the language that you use, and I usually don't like to bring them up, it reminds me of things that Jordan Peterson says, but you're not attributing a norm to them like they should be. What do you think about that type of language? We need to return to this old modern view to make sense of the world, and it's because we've moved away from that society is breaking apart.
But you have to ask, you have to look at why has it become unbelievable? For example, 2 world wars, the Shoah, genocide. The idea of Europe representing itself as some kind of maximally civilized culture, an avant-garde for the rest of humanity.
Right.
It's not credible.
It's not credible.
No.
But of course, I don't know enough about Jordan Peterson to ask what he makes of those facts. He may want to say, yeah, but sure, but let's not forget that the European world also brought us the Enlightenment, and it brought us great Gothic cathedrals and so on. And I wouldn't want to deny that. What I was saying, however, is that perhaps every culture, but certainly Europe's historical culture, has contained within the very thing which we celebrate some danger and some disaster. So I don't think there's a question of just saying, well, we've got to get back to that default understanding of world history on the way to the end. The last great effort at that, incidentally, which I do not belittle at all, is Francis Fukuyama.
Okay.
He totally understood that in the wake of 2 world wars, it was very hard to think optimistically about the world history. And but when the Soviet Empire collapsed, he said it was possible once more to think that there is some general direction of world history towards a particular end, and he conceived that as that perfection, as it were. Although we're not there, he just said it's as it were. We now know what it would be a fully realized liberal democracy. And he said that basically that there's no way of conceiving political development in which one could think that there could be something better than that. Now, he wasn't overconfident about that fact. I mean, he believed it to be the case that this was what was happening, but he wasn't unambiguously in favour of it, in the sense that he wondered what life would be like in that condition, where we no longer have an ambition to go beyond ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
An absolutely central part of European history, and the part that, if I was talking to Jordan Peterson, I'd want to insist on, perhaps he'd approve of this, is that Europe's history is a history of wanting to go beyond itself, to break with itself, and to be faithful with itself when it does that. It's being most faithful when you don't just do the same thing all the time. But having this idea of something as yet unattained for us. America is such a beautiful example of this. I've been speaking about Europe, but America is a country which is born of the idea of attaining itself, and as yet having not attained itself.
Right. And yeah, I get you.
Depending on who you're speaking to, there's many movements in the United States today that think that America was attained 20, 30 years ago, and now we're just moving away from it.
Right. Okay. I wonder if they would completely accept that it was completely attained. I don't believe they could believe that. But one of the things that Fukuyama thought was that people who inhabited this end of history world, who no longer attained to go beyond themselves, never attempted to go beyond themselves, to attain something beyond themselves. These are what he called, following Nietzsche, actually, the last men. And the last men are absolutely trivial human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And all they're interested in is entertainment, what in the Romans used to call bread and circuses. And we're a desperately dismal, trivial, superficial kind of people. And I have to say, I think that one of the problems we do face today in our time, given that we're, as it were, in this position of no longer inhabiting the old world, inhabiting what Samuel Beckett called the ruins, we inhabit the ruins of the old world.
Yeah.
In that situation, we don't strive for a future. And if we're not striving for a future, who are we?
Mm.
And this is the place we're at. I think it's a very difficult period to live in. A philosopher who's quite dangerous but also very interesting, called Heidegger.
Oh yeah.
He says we're not in decline, but it's an enduring pause. It's like we're just not going anywhere. And Paul Valéry, a French poet, says we're backing into the future.
I like that. We're backing into the future.
I like that. Yeah.
And headed I know not where.
Right.
And I think that idea of no longer knowing where we're heading is very destabilizing. I'm sure somebody like Jordan Peterson regrets this. You know, we would wish that we could rediscover our old heading and re-inhabit it. But my view is that it's
nothing can ever go back to the exact same
you
that
can't
it was,
go
right?
back. It's
exactly.
It's a fantasy to think that we can return.
It's
to
incredible.
That. It is incredible. Yes, exactly.
It's incredible.
I don't see any wise or logical way that we need to think about going to any past state and thinking. I mean, the average living age in the late 1800s was 36, 37, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But the flip side of that, though, which is no fun either, is that we're sort of lost.
We are.
And I find that very difficult. However, I do say to my students that what we do isn't something that we can then just say, well, we can just throw our hands in the air and do nothing. One of the things about what we do is that it will have been what happened before. What happened? It will have been what happened before what happens later.
Okay.
And so that we are. I've got terrible sun in my eyes. I'm sorry about this.
No, I see that. It must be very uncomfortable.
Very uncomfortable.
Yeah. If you need to move or anything, we've got plenty of time. Let me ask you real quick, Professor. How much time do we have you for? Because we'd love to keep you on for hours if you want to stay, but we don't want to.
We also
chip into your time
at one point
today.
want to open up a few people want to ask questions. And
I'd love to hear some questions. I think I think the sort of just to finish off the bit that I was talking about.
Yeah, go ahead. Take your time.
Would be that let's say following Samuel Beckett, that the distinctive feature of our time is that we are in an age who has a sense that they belong to a time in which a time-honoured conception of human beings is in ruins. So the way in which we have thought about ourselves is in ruins. We don't have a new way. And so I do think that the most fertile and interesting and future-producing activity for us today is thinking about what it means to be a human being. And of course, as a philosopher, I would say that, wouldn't I? But on the other hand, I believe it. I believe that asking ourselves, what does it mean to be a human being? There's no more important question for us today.
I agree.
And if we're going to overcome not only the kind of absence of a heading or absence of a direction, but also the sorts of what would one call it, the sort of racism, the Eurocentrism, sexism, all sorts of sort of structures of prejudice which belong to our have belonged to our world.
Mm-hmm.
If we're going to get beyond them, I think it will involve rethinking what it means to be a human being, and I'm very optimistic about that. I think that there are no human cultures that do not have an understanding of what it is to be human. And I think that that fact is deeply important. I think it means that we are a being who has some understanding of its own being.
Mm-hmm.
Our own being, what it is to be what we are, is an issue for us. And asking the question of our being is the most basic question for us. And I fear sometimes that this question gets eclipsed and not asked. But
I agree with you.
But I also think it's unavoidable. So I can't be.
This reminds me of like Heidegger's design or Dasein, in a way.
Well, totally. You're right to think that. I think what he's trying to do there is precisely to ask the question of our being again, anew.
Yeah,
and,
I think it's a question that we have to consistently ask as like society changes and technology changes. What it means to be human also changes. And if we don't consistently...
Well, our understanding of what it means to be a human being
correct.
certainly changes, and we change as we understand ourselves differently.
Yeah.
It's a self-transformation. So there's, as one occupies a new self-understanding, the whole life of life is transformed with that. And,
agreed.
I think it remains for us. One final thing on this is that I would tie this very closely to democracy, political democracy. One of my favourite thinkers on democracy is a French philosopher called Jacques Derrida. What he was committed to in thinking about democracy was that democracy is uniquely the only regime where the question, what is democracy, remains open. It's not.
Wow, that's a good way to put it. That's a really good way to put it. I like that.
And so we have to suppose that democracy has a relationship to its own future, which is one in which it can be rethought and reimagined and understood differently and self-transforming. So instead of being a regime which, as it were, has some essence or some definition which is fixed for all time, and we either attain it or we don't. Attaining a democratic condition means that the question of whether what we're doing is democratic remains for us.
It seems like the democratic way is the ultimate and continuing dialectic.
Of?
I mean,
what it means of what it means to be a democracy, what it means to be human,
exactly that.
what it means to be human, what it means to be right, what it means to be wrong, right?
Yeah. Okay. So the question, what is democracy, is inexhaustible. Right?
Yes.
It doesn't come to an end. And if you can begin to think that there's no end of democracy in that sense, and hence no end of democratic history, then you really are moving away from that old story of world history as a movement towards
religious.
Exactly.
Okay, same theme. Okay, same motif.
Yeah. Okay, let's take some questions now.
I love that.
Yeah, that was a really good way to tie it up. I love that. That was great. We did one of our friends, Marcus, on here. He called dibs on the first questions because this is his area, so he enjoys talking about this. So, Marcus, you can unmute, buddy, and come on in.
Yes, thank you. Hello, Professor Glendinning.
Hello, you can call me Simon.
All right, Simon. Yeah, it's a bit easier. I have so many questions.
Okay.
Firstly, let's start more with the philosophical stuff, and maybe we'll speak briefly about politics. But
yeah, well, let's say 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll try to get somebody else in. Okay,
okay, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
My first question would be: are you familiar with the master of Wittgenstein, if you will? You mentioned Heidegger and Wittgenstein. Have you read Spengler or Toynbee at all? Yeah, all right.
Can I answer that question now?
Yes, please.
I'm so glad you asked.
Yeah, so my mind.
I last year I was reading something about Wittgenstein and his life, and I was very struck by the fact that throughout his life he often recommended to his friends that they read Spengler, The Decline of the West. And I hadn't read it, and I thought, well, okay, Wittgenstein, you've been around in my life for a long time, maybe I should follow your advice. Now, Spengler's Decline of the West is 2 absolutely enormous volumes. And I was completely blown away by it, actually. I mean, he's clearly a dangerous person in some respects, but his critique of that Eurocentric way of looking at world history is awesome. What he says is that instead of thinking that there's just one linear history of all humanity, with each culture, as it were, at different stages in this development, what you've got is different humanities blossoming in different places at different times in the history of humanity, and that each one is a singular, unique culture, just like a person. Just like each person is singular and unique, so all these cultures are too. And of course they meet each other at various points, but when they meet each other, they tend, he thinks, to meet each other through the lens of their own self-understanding, right, primarily. And so although there can be all sorts of influences across cultures, these influences go into spaces which are unique inscriptions of what it is to be a human being. And he thinks that there is no thing that is man, that each one of them instantiate. Rather, each one is a way of understanding what it is to be a man, to be human. And he calls this quite openly a relativism. There's no privileging one culture over another. Then he says about each one of these cultures, they last about 1,000 years. So
did you not know about Egypt?
I think that I'll just tell you how he answers that. It's that you have beginning in a period of a sort of chaotic cultural condition, which slowly gives birth, as it were, to some culture, and then the culture will grow like a plant will grow until it finally blossoms. And what it blossoms when it's a culture is it hits what he calls a civilization. And so you have a movement from pre-culture to civilization as the three stages. And the culture part takes about 1,000 years. The civilization can hang around for centuries.
Right. Okay.
Longer and longer. But it's not going anywhere. It's sort of like it's just completed. And the only thing that holds it together is that it hasn't got anywhere else to go.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually he thinks it will sort of return back to the soil and go back into a chaotic state. And then at some point another culture will grow. Or out of it, in any case, perhaps a culture will develop. So that's Spengler. And I think although his view of our own condition was, well, I don't know, on one respect, it's very prescient. He says that what happens to our culture, Europe's, the Western culture, the culture of Western humanity, as it reaches its civilizational period, which we have, according to him, is that you will see eventually the emergence of what he calls Caesars, new dictators and tyrants. And he was writing this in 1912 to 1916, before many of the tyrants of the 20th century came on the scene. But of course, they did come on the scene, and we had fascism, Nazism, Stalinism, and one has to look at America and other places and wonder if the forces of politics in America may also be Caesarist. I hope they're not. I think
they almost were. They're almost
they
in the
almost
1920s
were.
and 30s. There was very big
Yeah.
fascistic movements in the United States.
Yeah.
I think if it wasn't for the war starting in Europe, that America wouldn't have broken out of that. And we see
Yeah.
very similar cult personalities happening today.
Yeah.
I don't think that
Yeah.
is.
So
I think-
this Caesarism, Spengler regarded it as unavoidable, and I think that's where he was wrong. And that's because I think he misunderstood what democracy was about. He thought democracy had a finality, that a final form,
Right.
and that it's now just finished. What I think Derrida really adds to this is to say, no, democracy is essentially something that has a future. But of course, it doesn't have a future all on its own, like without us participating in that future. But we are all participants in it. So I don't
It's
think
evolving,
we have to,
right?
Yeah, we don't have to think that have to succumb to Caesarism.
If I may, because this
please.
goes back all the way to the beginning with magic, henceforth I ask. I am of the belief, as Spengler is, as I would argue even Guillaume Battista Vico, which perhaps you have read as well, the historian rhetoric from the 18th century. And in a way, Heidegger, in a strange fashion, might be, but and Toynbee, of course, that, like you were mentioning earlier with magic and religion, I see that sort of metamorphosis happening culturally. Like our understanding of history is also a cultural fiction or projection, as Spengler would put it, right? Yeah. So you are left with this idea that everything which is produced by our culture dictates and dominates the way we observe the world. Both politically it's expressed and all these other things, right? Yes. So I can't help but realize, especially in regards to Europe, as a European myself, that he was right not just about the 20th century, but also the 21st century. And what we see here is precisely you were asking earlier, how does democracy get answered? Well, I think only Caesar can answer that question. And I think culturally, we will progress towards
Let him
that.
get in,
I think we're already on the decline of it, as you will. But obviously decline and progression are both, assuming that there is some form of linearity, either towards the future or towards the past, where Spengler is essentially saying the future and the past are both just fictions. The only thing that there is the here and now, and the rest are all byproducts, if you will, of your mind. How do you see magic and its morphology turning into religion rather than into science? Because that's where Spengler and kind of Nietzsche too, in this case, science, see that thing. I think you used the term earlier, transgressing or something alike, that it merges.
You gotta
if you
let
will,
him answer, my
culturally.
brother.
No, it's fine. I mean, I think you shouldn't have passed over the point I made already. I want you to come back one step. When you said, I think Spengler is right, and that we're moving into a kind of a period where the predominant tendency will be towards a Caesarist moment in world history, in European world history, or the history of the West, or given quite how global it is, like everywhere. I said that I thought there was a problem in his analysis because he supposed that democracy had a final form, and that was what I was saying isn't the case. So don't tell me how you see. I think that fact interrupts his sort of almost inevitable, his sense of the inevitable happening.
Yes.
Can you go back onto that point?
Sure, yes. I would say it's already the case geopolitically, if we finalize it with politics. I think all the dreams of the extremely Caesarian regimes of the 20th century have been realized by the European Union. As for NATO allied forces, Europe has a larger army now than it's had in hundreds and hundreds of years. As for the cultural aspects of it, like you mentioned earlier, we completely lost. And each day seems to be getting worse. Majority of people seem to be looking for an answer, which, to my greatest fear as well, is perhaps going to be given by a politician, a populist one of some sorts, which then reassures that strong national identity, if you will. And as a result, we get a repetition of the last century, like with, Napoleon or Hitler or Frederick or any of the other strongmen, if you will, that answer the question of democracy in a time of crisis.
Right, but they're not answering the question of democracy. They're opposing it, and they might oppose it by saying we now know that it doesn't work, or we now know that democracy is finished, or whatever. And my claim was that isn't the case. Do you think I'm do you think that our democratic institutions are simply exhausted, and so there's no future for them?
No, I think much like Spengler, that this is culturally relative, and that you and I, people who don't believe this, are becoming a minority each day. Whether this question is found in extreme leftism or rightism or whatever the spectrum might be, I do think that there is an increasing demand, if you will, for answers politically.
Yeah,
which
I agree
that
with
is
that. I mean, one of the things that I think is increasingly finished, or even is already over, but it could linger around for a long time, is the party form of democratic politics. So
precisely, yeah.
The political party has been hasn't got a particularly long history. We tend to suppose that now we have it. It's the form of electoral politics and representative politics that will go on forever. But I think it's increasingly clear that it's unadapted to the current world, and there are many people who've called for the end of the party. One of the ones which I regard as great is by a thinker called Simone Weil, and she wrote in just after the Second World War, I think, called "On the Abolition of All Political Parties." And she made an argument for thinking that our politics would improve enormously were we to abolish parties, and indeed we would lose nothing. So what you have is still have electoral representatives, but instead of being, as it were, mouthpieces for a political party, and so couldn't be political thinkers themselves, each one of them can make alliances with others, but these would be fluid and shifting, and you would elect representatives among people who they would set out their platform for you, and you would choose the one that you like best in the way we do now, but as it were, that is, say, through an election, but no longer through the party form. And so, that's just to give you an example of that we are participants in a history of democracy which is not over. And I do regard the contemporary forms of electoral politics as hollowed out in disastrous ways, really dangerous ways, which only cultivate those sort of Caesarist dimensions. But I don't think that's an inevitable consequence. I think, on the contrary, there can be internal transformations of democracy itself, where we rethink what it would be to elect representatives and how that would be practiced in a democracy. And honestly, I do believe that is a hope.
Yeah.
Yes. I must
Marcus, real
say
quick,
then
buddy,
that,
real quick. Marcus,
Yes,
just
sir.
finish up here and make a good final point or a final question, and then we're gonna try to get a couple more in before our friend has to go. Okay.
Sure, yeah. Thanks.
Okay.
Veil, somebody asked in the chat, Veil, how to spell it. It's W-E-I-L.
Well done. Right. So politically speaking,
Yeah.
again, I must then say that, like you were mentioning earlier, democracy only works insofar like it did in Athens and like it has in even the sort of primitive the United States, where the people themselves are in a direct influence on government to the extent where democracy, if you will, is reflective of the democratic peoples or the populace of the polis, traditionally speaking, or the nation or whatever. We as Europeans, I think, have culturally progressed so far with burgherism from Prussia and from Germany and the cosmopolitan sort of French idealistic me, that all these concepts, I understand what you say by rational humans or rational animals. I understand. I would say humans themselves, the term from Leibniz, it's alone, would be sufficient insofar as explaining what sort of a colloquial term for the me, the ipsum, would be for different European interpretations.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you, Mark, because you said
Thank you,
something
Mark.
that I'd like. Yeah, thank you. One thing I'd like to pick up on was that reference to America, which I've mentioned once, but I think it's worth highlighting for people who are listening, that perhaps take an opportunity today, if they might, to reread one of the great texts on democracy in modern history, which is the Gettysburg Address.
Yes, it is.
Lincoln.
You're right.
Which is an extraordinary piece of writing. It's incredibly short, but it's all about inheriting something which you pass on as an inheritance, and that you don't want it to come to an end. You have to pick up the task of making a democracy, or making a government that is by the people and for the people, and that you will not let that perish. You have a task, on the contrary, you have a task to make it live. And you make it live not by just doing the same, but by inheriting it yourself, by creating it anew in each new generation. So, your reading for tonight, everybody, is the Gettysburg Address, which will take you probably think you know it backwards, but I would still read it again. There are various versions, but just read one of them.
And the Gettysburg Address is phenomenal. Yeah. I think Lincoln's appeal to it's our job to usher the birth of a new freedom every generation.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say that this isn't happening today, though? And henceforth, democracy itself.
I think it is happening. Marcus, I think it is happening in many
in Europe,
circles.
At least, so far as where I'm at, I don't see very many people actually embodifying democracy whatsoever. We've seen that with the last 2 or 3 years here, with the whole pandemic and the governmental reaction and the extreme authoritarian reactions and people's reactions to it. People are so complacent. Same in the UK, I would say. They're too complacent, if you will, for democracy to even be a thing. And like you said, the inheriting part, people are lost. They're not even aware of what they have inherited.
I know they are. I think you're right that a lot of people are lost. I just don't think it's over. And I think one of the reasons it isn't over is, for example, that we still have elections. And although that's a very formal feature of a modern democracy, it nevertheless has the structure of self-critique. So the thing that I believe is at the heart of a Europe that one wants to keep rather than lose is this tradition of interminable self-critique. And one of the things that an election is that you can have a complete change of government, and that the people who are in power have to accept the result. Which is why actually the American election, last presidential election, was so important, when it was nearly the case that the outgoing president did not accept the result, and indeed, of course, has challenged many times the propriety of the electoral process. It's a very difficult situation. But on the other hand, he did leave the White House.
He did.
And there will be elections again. And an electoral cycle, however formal it is still a representation of the possibility of transformation. And in each case, you will get people coming in who will make arguments, make claims, what can be called a claim for us, where you say what would, in your view, be overall the best thing for us. And making that kind of claim has been historically a partisan claim. It's been about a party that says that we have the best view overall of what's best for us. But it doesn't have to be a partisan claim. It can be a voice that may seek alliances. That's the future. Let me just say, we still have an electoral cycle. We still have party politics, but we still have an electoral cycle, and it is through that even however formal it may be, that this possibility of self-critique has not left us yet.
Okay. Dandan, do you
Thank
have
you
something?
so much.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. You had great questions. Dandan, did you want to make a few comments? I think the next person in line is in our. Let me ask, Simon, how long do we have you, buddy? We don't want to overkeep you.
Well, I'm not really doing anything, so I don't care.
Yeah, I mean,
in
this
that
is
case,
what
I have 10 more questions lined up.
Well, yeah, here in a minute, Marcus. This is what we do all day.
Yeah, we
Simon,
hang out
so
and
we don't care.
I
we
just
talk about this stuff
I
all the
really
time, so
like
go ahead.
I've heard a lot of people talk about democracy is one of the only systems that is able to change itself consistently.
Yeah.
It's able to
Yeah.
become a new birth of freedom, and I think just maybe and people don't know, Madison, one of the founding fathers of the United States, said something very similar, where the Constitution should be rewritten every 2 generations for its tyranny for an old generation to tell a new generation how to live its life in a way. And it builds on the same idea of democracy right now is the institution that does let us ask the question again, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be democracy? Right? And I really like that perspective, the incorporation of the design into like a political system. That question.
Yeah, this is kind of the dialectic I was talking about a minute ago. At least how I see it. I mean, I may be incorrect about the terminology, but...
Well, yeah. I don't know. The thing about dialectic is that generally it's conceived as something that works itself out towards some kind of final resolution. So...
oh, okay, yeah.
In Hegel
in the
and
act of
Marx,
synthesis, yeah, you're right.
It moves towards an end. And I think that my own way of thinking about democracy and politics is that it has to be freed. I'm going to use a quasi-technical term now, but it needs to be freed from all teleology.
Yes.
Freed from the idea that there is some final perfection that we're aiming to attain.
Yeah.
What I want to keep, though, and perhaps Thomas, I'll keep the idea of dialectic here a bit, is the possibility of, and comes from an American philosopher called Emerson, attaining the as yet unattained possibility of being. We should, and another American philosopher, Stanley Cavell, says that we should think of politics as inseparable from the right to make that step for ourselves, to attain the as yet unattained possibility of being for myself. This possibility of self-transformation through self-critique, that for me is what philosophy today is about, but it's also for me the hope that remains within the European world once it gets rid, in the process of getting rid of the old idea of a kind of final perfection and of itself as at the head of world history.
Like you said, free from all teleology, right?
Yeah.
Free from any.
It reminds me of something I've heard Zizek say, which is that utopia isn't something to achieve, but rather something to yearn for. Just something.
Right. Okay. But I think of the way I've put it is more resolutely non-utopian. Okay. Because there's no finality, there's no final perfection, right? Exactly. It's not that you yearn towards...
Yeah, what would the final utopia even be?
Right? I mean, I think that's what he was saying. I think he was saying that you're not going to achieve it. It's just a matter of dreaming, wanting it, like trying to better consistently.
I've seen Zizek saying things like this, and it's impressive because at least what he's saying is we have to go beyond. You know, that idea of going beyond is part of what makes life worth living, as it were. But he does complicate his own quasi-utopianism there, because he routinely will say that the light at the end of a tunnel is a train coming at you at the other direction.
Yeah, because he's always like contrarian. He always wants to make things spicy and be confusing on purpose.
It simple, I think he's very interesting. But I would prefer there's this sort of non-utopian way of thinking it, which is that resolutely non-utopian, which means that what you aim for is not, for example, some ideal justice, which would be utopian, but to eliminate injustice or injustices. A great example of this is an example from another American philosopher called Judith Shklar. Okay. She gives the example of the abolition of slavery. You could now, one could have in the past fought against slavery as something that would be legitimate and allowed, and call for its abolition. And that would be an effort to get rid of a particular injustice that scars our world. But one of the things, of course, she'll say is that one can't think that one does these things once and for all, that it's all over and done with, or that, for example, slavery might not reappear in some other form or by another name, or whatever. And so the idea of attaining some final perfection, that's gone, but nevertheless you can put your energy, real energy, political energy, into eliminating injustices. And not without success. There's now a British philosopher, Bernard Williams, who says something like, success is what politics is all about. It's about making changes in which conditions which were intolerable are overcome in some way. I don't see that there's any other way of thinking about politics which is which has a future for us. The utopian way doesn't, but the resolutely non-utopian way, which is to say, instead of being future projecting, it's about eliminating past injustice. That seems to me something we can carry forward.
Yeah, I like that idea.
One of the things that I think just came straight to my mind was, I think it was like 2 years ago or whenever, all over the news, everyone was talking about critical race theory. And I didn't know anything about it. So I was like, let me just go research this real quick. And one of their main criticisms is this idea that we've ended the inequality with the Civil Rights Act. And now that it's over, we're done.
Right.
That is like one of their biggest criticisms of like what is happening in American society, where it's almost like this end of history, post inequality reality that now they're having to contend with.
Don't have to deal with the problems anymore.
Right, that's a really great point, and one might also speak to that in a similar way. Let's not suppose that the critical race theory that we have now is the last word.
Correct, exactly.
Our condition, right? And so to suppose that any of those texts are beyond criticism, that they have to be now saluted as sacred texts, that would seem to be a mistake. And
correct.
I'm sure the best thinkers involved in critical race theory would acknowledge the same themselves, that they wouldn't want to see themselves as giving the last word. There's one example of this that I myself would want to put pressure on the sort of what one might call the first generation of critical race theory, is the emphasis placed on systemic racism, or structural racism, that's the only form that racism takes, essentially, that anything else is just prejudice. And I don't really believe that. I think I saw a talk by Jacques Derrida once where he was talking about growing up in Algeria. Mm-hmm. He quite happily said that there were racists everywhere. The Jews against the Arabs against the French. And he said, and he said about himself, I had a bit of that stuff about the French myself. And you know, to suppose that racism can't be
interpersonal,
thought out in terms of in interpersonal relationships, it seems to me that something that needs to be looked at. But on the other hand, that something is not the last word doesn't mean that it's not the first word, and that's, you know, all to be welcomed. I think. I think confronting. I think it's extraordinary that and wonderful in a way that confronting racial prejudices in our societies is still going. It's so. If you don't mind me, I apologise on her behalf if I shouldn't be saying this, but my wife is in Australia at the moment.
Oh.
And she is seeing a history, a legacy of racism there against
the Aboriginals and stuff.
Aboriginal people, and extraordinary genocides that were going
Unbelievable.
on over periods until so recently. None of this being acknowledged, and disturbingly recently.
Yeah.
But today, it doesn't mean that today we've got over it and everything's all right now, but it's also sort of recognisably something to which people are alive rather than not alive at all. And there's something good in that, you know, that it's better. But it's being discussed, and it's difficult and uncomfortable, and it's very uncomfortable for the dominant culture of Australia today to face up to its own history. But that's true for so many
so many different cultures. Yeah. It's even true. I mean, I grew up in Israel, and I know my family members dealing with that history, right? All my grandparents are Holocaust survivors, and they come to Israel and find themselves in a way instantiating that same type of mentality when it comes to Mizrahi, Sephardi, or Jews around the area. So that history that they themselves don't want to contend with. But when we're talking about them using racism and prejudice, I think this is something that a lot of academics fail, is with their ontology becomes so hyper specific and unrecognizable to other disciplines or other forms of communication. That really does create problems.
Yeah.
Could it be if I may, could it be? Thank you, by the way. Could it be because part of our cultural decline and decadence includes no longer having a solid grounding of race itself, like me as the individual? What is my race? What the word race even mean?
Oh, is that Marcus again?
Yeah,
yes,
Marcus jumped in.
That's so interesting.
He couldn't help himself. This is like his favorite subject. Marcus,
Okay.
one more time, and then we've got. I said we were going to move to another questioner.
But I've got to answer this a bit.
Okay.
One of the things, just in a way, speaking to Marcus, one of the things about Spengler is that he has a theory of race which is completely non-biological.
Yes.
And that is an extraordinary thing about him. And for him, the archetype of race is not a certain kind of human physiognomy, but a house.
Yeah.
And he says that race is not recognizable in a corpse. So it has nothing to do with skin color, for example, and or bone structure or the shape of your
critical
skull.
race theorists think the same way. They think it's a social construct. They don't think it's
Well, that's not what he's thinking. He thinks it's a real feature of human life, and it belongs to the way in which life is expressed most spontaneously. So you might, obviously, I mentioned the house, but for the human being, it would involve things like the way you speak and the way you walk, and the way you inhabit a cultural world, that socially constructed cultural world. And he thinks that this is how one should think about race, that it has nothing to do with biology at all. So he's completely opposed to all that Nazi stuff that came and the raciology of the 19th century. But Marcus, that's just for you. So if you want
to... thank you so much. Yes, I've been trying to get this across for so long. I think the difference between biological race and if you will, phenomenological race or spiritual race or conceptual race or fictional race. This biological race thing, which obviously mainly came from Germany around the 19th, 20th centuries.
And France, actually.
Yes, specifically. This needs to go. This I think is the root for all this. This racism itself, as I understand it, became a colloquial term for xenophobia. And it's always referring to negative connotations relating biological features. Never once do you, like you tried to mention, get an instance on the news or hear from someone, oh, that guy was really racist, but he actually didn't do anything wrong. He actually helped someone who he loved, and he was a loving type of racist. Can we even imagine such a thing as a lovable racist or someone?
I think it's a sign of the difficulty, though, that we're in, is that the conception of race that we live with today is the biological conception.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But
this is why
whether you're a racist or an anti-racist, the race question is about phenotypical differences or differences between
but not always, because there's a lot of recognition that, for example, Italians and the Irish in the United States were considered black before World War II, which is like the recognition that race as it's been used even in American history didn't only depend on skin color, right?
If you read that, of course, but it's still the dominant form.
Yeah, most people think of race as biological race. Yes.
Yeah,
and it's because of the last century. I think the imprint World War II has left us socioculturally. We've not moved on yet.
No.
That's why I think, like Spengler says with civilization, I think our cultural epoch has turned from culture to civilization with World War II and both the great wars, really, in the 20th century. I think it was that point where we culturally became stagnant, where we didn't move on. How many conversations?
You know my job, Marcus. You know what I got to do. I got to keep the show moving. I got to keep the show moving, Marcus. Maybe you and the good professor here can have email talks, because I'm sure you would have a million questions for him. Dandan, do you have anybody else in queue to ask any questions? Did you get anything on YouTube?
Not on YouTube, but I did get SVXZone7 wanted to ask a question. Do you want to ask a question so you can unmute and go ahead right now?
Hello there.
Hello.
Simon, it's an honor and a pleasure, and I'm in the London area, so I wanted to just keep it short because it'd be nicer to possibly have a nicer coffee or a salon sometime. Anyway, one interesting question I thought you might have a good reflection on is the scaling of the demos and historically looking forward into a future, because I understand that the Greek demos was about 500,000 or something on that level, and the largest democracies we have now are over 1,000 billion, and theoretically in the future it could be way more.
Yeah. I mean, actually, what you're talking about, though, there is really the state. And in the Greek state was a city, city-states, and we have nation-states. And of course, in between those, at some point, and still not disappeared, are empire states. And the Roman Empire or the British Empire would have had relationships between its own demos and other people, which are very complicated indeed. But I don't see that there's any a priori reason, just by thinking about it, which says that a particular size of demos of a population of a democracy is the best size or the right size. I don't see that at all. I don't think any country has benefited intrinsically from being a particular size as far as its democracy is concerned. What made you think that it might?
It was more about, I spend a lot of time thinking about the future and the evolution of things, being a person who's much more on the both utopian and utopian hunting side of things. I mean, I always like reflecting on a couple of really important democracy quotes to just, regular folks to be able to understand that. The first one is that democracy, of course, is the worst form of governance, except everything else that's ever been tried. A lot of people don't realize that democracy is a complex thing that is not supposed to be perfect, but rather the way I look at it is it keeps our head of being civilized just above water, which is not so shabby.
Yeah,
and second one, of
totally.
course, for my fellow Brits and Americans, is that Churchill said, these are both Churchill, by the way, is that Americans will always do the right thing after they try everything else. So in terms of these aspects of the reality of, when we were living in the philosophy, we were looking at democracy as something important that we embrace very much as part of our Western liberal democracy project of freedom and rights.
Yeah, it's
whatnot.
constantly changing, right? That's kind of what
exactly.
Simon's been getting at.
Yeah, and it's just that as there's more, to say about the scale aspect is as there's more and more people, more and more noise within the demos, essentially. People who representationally in a Republican democracy or a democracy, whatever, America, right? People have a sense of a lot more participation in terms of opinion, and I don't think this is right, and I don't think that's right. And I've run for MP here in England, and I plan to run again once this government either falls or no later than January 2025. But the idea that people want to feel that they're part of the decision-making process, but as a Canadian, I'll just leave with that as opposed to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is America's sort of slogan, Canada's is peace, order, and good governance. So in my mind, as a Canadian American, now also Brit, there's a lot of different perspectives on what people's participation is. And a lot of it comes down to where it's sort of a peak confusion and a peak ability to stimulate people with a little agitating propaganda for fun and profit. Anyway, I guess one of the yield my time back.
No, you're good, man. Thank you for the good question. And we're close to wrapping things up, guys, but we're going to let Simon go ahead and respond to this.
Okay, just on this one, that one of the things, of course, you do tend to get within these always inadequate democracies is distinctions between local and national, or local, regional, national, supranational. Once you get into big spaces like in America or India, you tend to have some kind of federal system a federation. United Kingdom is currently still, a multinational political entity.
Is it like a parliamentary democracy? Is that what that would be?
Well, it is, but I'm just thinking that there's Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland.
I see.
So you've got more than one country with one state. But you've got quite a lot of regional devolution, and even independent of that, you've got massive amounts of local government. And that's pretty much the same everywhere. So, of course, there was a good question about size, but the good question about size is generally speaking one where you see nested levels of government from the local to up to, in some sense, global things like the United Nations and so on, or Chinese ambitions to have transnational governance, which they might run.
Or the crown.
Excellent. Dandan, did you want to?
Last thing I actually want to ask.
Go ahead.
Last thing I want to ask. I gotta ask you, what does your necklace represent?
Ah, okay. I don't know if anybody can see that. You'd have to be able to.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, we can see
No,
it. What I can't.
It's a crossword, and the words are Phos and Zoe.
Okay.
And in thinking about what it is to be a human being, one thing you might think is that we are a kind of light bestowing being. We inhabit a space which is illuminated, in the sense that things are revealed. And so when I look out around me here, I can see the computer in front of me and the tables and chairs and pictures on the wall and the window. So these are all things that are disclosed to me, illuminated. And one might think that it's because I am myself illuminated in a certain way that where I am is illuminated too. So like a flame shines and illuminates its surroundings, but the flame is itself just shine, is light.
Yeah.
So you have this thing that is itself illuminating what's around it. And the Greek word for that is phos.
That's very Jewish Kabbalistic. Actually, I'm very surprised. Well, it's been amazing.
Yes, you're right. Actually,
yeah.
No, you're fine.
Yeah, I grew up very religious Orthodox, and I read a lot of Kabbalah and Zohar and stuff. So there's a lot of talking about us being Oganus and whatever, all that nonsense. But
right. Yeah, very good.
Well, Simon, thank you so much for coming on. We've honestly had a pleasure talking with you. But we're hitting 2 hours.
So,
and it's
Simon, thank you so much. I love that this is my area, and I love it. And this is Dandan's area, and of course, Marcus. We thank Marcus for his excellent questions.
Yeah,
and
thank you,
SBX.
Thank you. Please come back a second time.
Yeah, and you have a Discord account, so you can actually jump in the Discord whenever you want. We talk about this all the time.
Yeah, you can come and talk to us anytime you feel.
I clearly can't. You have to give me some personalised entry ticket, because when I was pressing the link, as I say, I went into a void. Here we are. I enjoyed that very much.
Excellent. Well, all right, Dandan, wrap her up.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Simon. We're going to probably continue the discussion later in the tavern where we hang out and have different conversations. But other than that, I got to take care of some stuff, and it's been fantastic. And, of course, Simon, the conversation was amazing. And, we'll catch us around next time we have an interview.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much, Simon. All right, guys, that was an excellent show. Thank you for everybody being very patient with us and everything. We're still trying to get this worked out, how we're going to do it on Discord. So appreciate everybody staying muted, and really appreciate it. It was good. Marcus, I'm sorry, man. I would have let you talk to him for 4 hours, but I had to keep moving along just to make sure we had other questions going on, because you had fucking fantastic questions.
Yes, you did.
I learned a lot. I learned a lot from that. I also learned be free of teleology. Wow, what a statement.
Amazing.
I like that. The constant democratic machine it's like science. It's like throwing the old out and putting the new in, and
exactly
having growing pains while we're doing all of that. let's everybody go down to the tavern, or if you want to split off and go into the garden and the spa, let's start going down there and getting out of the live hangout, and we can have discussions continuing this. But Dandan's got to go, and I got to go grab something to eat.
Exactly,
so
and the bathroom's calling. So
yeah, bathroom's calling me too. So let's hop down there, guys.
Boys. Thank you.
Yeah,
This is great. You did great.